La vérité touche au réel.
Young Jacquians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia, Isabel Millar.
Engaging in conscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
Do I introduce you?
You're the master for today. You're the presenter.
Oh God, I don't like being in this.
Too much responsibility.
Just remember to edit this part out.
Yeah.
Whoa. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Vanishing Mediators. I'm Nick. Stickle backing that ass up. Joined by Maximilian.
Still no
And
nickname.
the big Signorelli. Still working on a nickname.
We need we could do a gang sign, you know? It's like
VM.
We figured out something. We did, yeah.
We did that back at the Barbie show. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right. I remember. Yeah.
VM.
There we go. And today we are going to be talking about the imaginary dissolution. We lost the original episode we recorded for this lecture because of water corrosion. The real invaded my computer and effectively destroyed it.
No, the little men went in there. Invaded.
Yeah, that's what the Apple technician said. The Apple store.
The little
like,
dyslexic going in there.
He's like, there appear to be fleeting improvised men all through your computer.
The Cassiopeia people came into your.
Anyway, I wrote like a kind of a summary of this chapter. It's a little long, but it's my pound of flesh, let's say, that I'm paying to enter the symbolic order of today. So I'll just jump in if it's cool with you guys.
Yeah.
And take a sip of my kombucha. All right, so Lacan initiates the lecture Imaginary Dissolution by explaining to his auditors how the concept of primary narcissism should not be oversimplified to the point that it means nothing more than the individual taking his own body as an object. If Schreber is to undergo a psychical shift so profound that he's unable to achieve object cathexis, then this state of secondary narcissism into which he lapses must entail certain imaginary ramifications. Focusing a psychoanalytic lens on the formation of his delusion reveals that the libido, drawn entirely into the ego, heightens self-regard to the point of megalomania. An acquiescence to primary narcissism, considered in this framework, indicates a psychical movement which, contra the reductive understanding of narcissism as merely erotic self-absorption, bears upon the psychotic's relation to the other. Schreber scrupulously evades castration by allowing no deleterious influence to make contact with his narcissism. His betrothal to God becomes an expedient to which he resorts for the end of escaping the threat of castration posed by his father. Bereft of any regulatory symbolic apparatus, i.e. the negational force of the law qua invocation of the name of the father, Schreber cannot gain any subjective footing in relation to the capital O other, big other. The intransigence of this ideal shatters the mirror of the, in quotes, he subject into an infinitude of ego fragments. His psychical life world, striated by a fundamental language only understandable by him, conforms to Freud's description of the structure of paranoia. I do not love him. I love God. God loves me. Here I forgot to write the inverse of that, which he adds, where it's, he loves me. Who is this he? And what is the nature of the psychotic withdrawal from objects? With these questions, Lacan casts doubt on the then popular psychoanalytic notions about the reality of objects and the self-consistency of the subject. The libido relies on the economy inherent to the structure of the psyche as a means of internally draining off excess excitation. Psychosis and neurosis are structures which bear resemblance to one another. The difference between the two pivoting on the question of which mechanisms are interrelated with which registers. Lacan asks, what are the levels, the registers by which we can define these modifications to the character of the other that are always, we very much get the impression, central to the alienation of madness? Can we hope to fix a sense of the nature of Schreber's delusion by likening it to the displacements common to hysteria? Lacan draws our attention to Freud's famous case study of Dora in order to demonstrate how the mechanism of psychosis modifies the character of the other in a way which is irreducible to the allocations of libido made by the mechanism of displacement. Dora, as a hysterical subject, is plotted at the corner of a quadrilateral axis. The advantage of this fourfold arrangement lies in the fact that by assuming the alter ego of Herr K through the mediation of her father, Dora is able to avoid the unbearable triangularity of her being situated between father and lover. Not so sure about that. I know you guys will get into that later, but the advances made by Herr K on Dora disturb the balance sustained by this quadrilateral arrangement, accentuating the quote-unquote relations of identification and rivalry, which characterize Dora's love for her father. The shock brought on by Herr K's proposal causes Dora to become convinced that she is the object of her father's persecution. Dora is, in her mind, the pound of flesh with which the cost of her father's love affair with Frau K has been paid. Are Dora's feelings of persecution therefore analogous to the paranoia experienced by Schreber? No, because an unreasonable or inaccurate claim made against an imagined persecutor cannot alone substantiate the hypothetical existence of a psychotic delusion in the patient. Why not? Even if Dora's accusations may count as hallucinatory, her experience herein cannot be considered delusional, inasmuch as an analysis of her symptoms does not produce evidence of disturbances in language. Certainly this quote-unquote, as Lacan says, this character's, her father's level of otherness has become modified. But one wonders if these modifications excite for Dora the alienation typical of madness. Is she flung back into a state of primary narcissism and as a result deprived of the ability to form object cathexes? If such were the case, Dora would be diagnosable as a psychotic. Although the dynamism of her refusal to consciously acknowledge her narcissistic love for her father gains its libidinal footing from an imaginary underpinning, a symbolic conflict still lies at the heart of the quadrilateral disequilibrium, which for Dora proves so intolerable. Such a state of affairs does not hold in the case of Schreber, for whom castration represents a lethal affront to his narcissism. Narcissism, Lacan claims, is an erotic relationship. Aggressivity is a theme which has in most of the psychoanalytic literature of Lacan's time been overemphasized. It is to the detriment of any possible understanding of the erotic vein present in the imaginary narcissistic relation that aggressivity is given the spotlight in this regard. Enthroned in and by the image reflected in the mirror of the ego is an illusory master whose apparent fluidity of motion and apparent self-sufficiency are perceived as an encroachment upon the ego's security. On the other hand, this image is an object of envy. The ego's desire to take its place is in a dialectical tug of war with its fear of its own place being usurped. The ego is nothing more or less than the radius along which this aggressive battle is waged, a battle coextensive with the ego's failure to synthesize itself with the drives. This failure on the ego's part to master the drives leads to a blurring of the line between inside and outside. The master's location can never be ascertained as existing inside or outside the ego. Only with the pacificatory intervention of the symbolic can a somewhat clear line of demarcation be drawn between inside and outside. Animals are faced with a similar problem. However, they aren't forced into a situation in which they would have to rely on the automaticity of the symbol as a means of coping with the insistence of drives. Instinctual behavior, fucking or eating, is for the animal triggered by lure. of the image behind this lure, Lacan says, there is no reason for this borderline I was speaking about between eros and the aggressive relation in man not to exist in animals. The sexual behavior of the stickleback fish, and it's a fish, exemplifies this dynamic. After the stickleback mates with the female member of his species, he will dig little holes around the place he had previously set up for lovemaking. By doing so, he appropriates a certain territory exclusively his own. If another male should approach the zone marked out by these little holes, the stickleback will become aggressive. Experiments have been carried out by scientists interested in finding out the precise distance from which a rival male can approach the stickleback's grounds before provoking this attack response. Quote, Lacan, there is thus a borderline defined by a certain distance at which the stickleback finds itself caught between attacking and not attacking, end quote. When a decoy of the enemy is made to appear at this borderline, the stickleback's response to the uncertain materialization of his counterpart is one of dithering confusion. The fish's reaction to this ambiguous situation, this is what I got wrong, because it's he engages in a kind of like erotic behavior, but Lacan brings up, these birds that like gloss their feathers in a similar situation. Thus, the stickleback is far from indifferent to its mirror image. This image for the human being exercises a function which Lacan calls the orthopedic complement of that native insufficiency, end quote, which characterizes the helplessness of man's prematurity. The imagistic capture at the heart of the imaginary, though, doesn't tell the entire story. At this point, Lacan presents us with a thought experiment. He invites us to picture a scenario in which many little animal-like machines are orchestrated to coordinate their movements with one another by means of images generated by photoelectric devices. If dependent as one of these animatronic mechanisms is on imitating the reflected movement of its counterpart, these robots were to be put on a track similar to that of a bumper car track, what would be the result? A pileup. How could we create the proper distance between these mechanisms in order to avoid such an outcome? Lacan here states that the proper meaning of the Oedipus complex therefore should be understood as the introduction of a third party, one that is coextensive with the function of speech. The source of this function is identified as the name of the father, which represents the invocation of a law. This law prevents imaginary aggressivity from coming to a head, and owing to the binding force of its prohibitive decree, one experiences a symbolic order set down by this invocation as having always already been in effect. In accordance with this logic, the superimposition of the symbolic upon the imaginary must always come from without, and thus a barrier between the outside and inside is established. However, things are not so clear-cut for Schreber. The thematic of the imaginary dissolution refers to the predominance of the mirror relation in connection with Schreber's relation to the outside. For the psychotic, the other has no enduring consistency. Capital O, other. In fact, the other, qua locus of signification, divides itself into two classes of being/non-being. On the one hand, we have the fleeting improvised men who have no substantial being and are but moving shadows, whereas the central characters in Schreber's life world, those possessed of being, number amongst the souls that enter his body. At the imaginary level, Schreber fails to comprehend an other which isn't either one of many copies of his own identity, or two, a fragmented piece of matter assimilated into a grand divine unity. In relation to either case, Schreber remains the singular, divinely called upon being whose privilege it is to marry God. The price he pays to avoid castration, however, is that of acting as a terminal through which these little beings come and go. Schreber, like many psychotics, hears voices. The volume of their pronouncements ranges from low whisper to resounding bass. God's enunciations are cryptic. Among them figure the enigmatic Luder or wretch. This feminizing, as Lacan calls it, expression, God hurls at Schreber with a quasi-erotic intention, as if to demean and excite him simultaneously. Affection and insult are concentrated in this singular word, which Lacan describes as the counterpart of the imaginary world. Is not the dialectic of eros/aggressivity seen here in this word painted in the most vivid of colors? It's worth mentioning that Schreber experiences language in two keys. The first is echt, which loosely translates to authentic, true. The second is just a mechanical, hollow refrain. Both forms of language are for Schreber emptied of all meaning in the sense which Saussure would ascribe to the signified. This language of the psychotic only points to itself, whether it be that which is supercharged with an ultimately inscrutable meaning, or that which is learned by rote and empty. These words, neologisms, formulae, are the provisional scaffolding of Schreber's universe, deprived as it is of a symbolic order built on the foundation of an other outside of him. His ego, all-embracing as it is, cannot allow for libidinal investments in objects which are, in the final analysis, signifiers. His world is certainly overpopulated by signifiers, but these signifiers are not experienced as derivatives of the big other qua locus of meaning. The mediating force of this third party, e.g., the symbolic order, is not present for Schreber, for whom signifiers emanate from the real. However, God's insults, wretch, for example, become for him the linchpin for his asubjective universe. They carry with them the agency of alienation, which the neurotic's object love makes possible. And because Schreber's ego cannot be individuated, not through the neurotic mechanism of repression, he remains uncastrated and unique, as Lacan puts it, the only man remaining after the twilight of the world. His penalty for refusing the name of the Father, however, is to live in constant fear of the precarious semblance of a symbolic order which he's established, and which is held together by virtue of enigmatic neologisms falling apart, and the imaginary relation upon which he depends being absorbed into yawning blackness. Within Schreber's psychotic universe, God is language, a language which bears the scars of its own inconsistencies. Consider the interruptions, slips, and various other scansion gaps in the continuity of speech which are brought to light through analysis. It's almost as if Schreber lives through these semiotic gaps at the level of time's unfolding. The duality of the term wretch and its fragmentary isolation within the phantasmagoria to which Schreber is subject ensures the continuance of a structure which safeguards him against castration while maintaining a semi-consistent simulacrum of the other qua language. And so there is no possibility for Schreber of the existence of a disembodied other, which is anything but a little other. Or as Lacan states, an, quote, other who is irreducible to anything other than the notion of another subject, that is, to the other qua he. Everything and everybody represents gradations and emanations of this he. The I is not for Schreber an other, but infinite little others. And so the imaginary relation, in its abortive function of mastery, its mismanagement of the drives, predominates. This then is the narcissism to which Lacan refers, not that of Dora's ensemble of displacements, which, though they may to a degree be hallucinatory, testify to the presence of an capital O other. But the question remains, beyond the function of imaginary reinforcement, of which Schreber's God of language acts as a guarantor, what are the nuances of Schreber's fundamental language, and how does the automaticity of this symbolic sentence expose qualities integral not only to the psychotic's relation to language, but also to language in neurosis? End.
Fantastic. That was good.
Yeah.
Also, the quads, all your quads are on point.
Quads on point. Working my quads.
Yeah, the quad father.
And you said that he starts out with asking the question what that he is, right? In the inversions that he takes from Freud, this I do not love him, I hate him, he hates me, right? And then Lacan says the problem is entirely one of this he, and then he kind of asks the question what this he is. And can you repeat
I forgot to
how you understood what Lacan's resolution of that question is?
My understanding is that if we think about the imaginary as having to do with this mere image, and if we think of the mirror stage and the child who envies the image for its, self-containment, as I put, like fluidity of motion. It's almost like its place is being usurped. It absorbs that image into it. It is absorbed into that image. There's this sort of like dialectic there. And it's the big other which ultimately intervenes in a way that, there's a third term to refer to, which is neither me nor my mirror image, again, which to even say that would be to like presuppose that such a distinction has been made. That distinction can only be made by the introduction of the big other into the dynamic. But it's like, I think for Schreber, everything is reducible to and like remains at the level of this mirror image. And what that would mean is that there is no subject. Remember, Lacan says the big other is like the subject. Among like the many valences of the big other, among them are like the big other as the subject, right? Like capital S subject. But Schreber doesn't have any possible conceptualization of that. So he has only, everything is he, right? Everything is this persecutory little other. And that's the degree to which he's able to approximate something like a big other, I think.
I was thinking
the other that is the I.
Yeah, I was thinking that he kind of was criticizing Freud a little bit for these inversion of these sentences, because on the last page, on page 101, he says, what characterizes Schreber's world is that this he is lost and only the you remains. So the way I read it was, he is like, that's the big other. It's not me and it's not you, but the he is like the word for the third party that you mentioned.
Right.
And it's like the big other. And I think he was saying like, yes, these inversions, that's great and so on, makes sense, but the he in them doesn't make sense because there is no he in psychosis.
Right. Because if you look at even
that makes more sense.
When you look at with the fragmentation that happens in Schreber's delusions, he's dead somehow. Yeah. And even Flessig is also dead, another he. And it's interesting how like he's certain that God wants him, but God's somewhere far away. And that the only way to keep him in that distance, maybe we call it that borderline between aggressivity and erotic, as far as, the libido and narcissism, is that it's this feminization that God puts onto him. And that's the only thing that isn't cryptic, because if God's language were cryptic, it would seem to become very castrating, because there is something that I think is really helpful to understand, not only just language for Schreber, but also language in the imaginary versus in the symbolic, and not to substantialize the two, but when you're admitted into the symbolic order via the name of the Father, we have the difference between the other qua language, in which, the mother or imaginary other speaks, and you have a fragmented voice for the baby, and then the other qua symbolic other, in which we are admitted via the signifier or the name of the Father, which creates the circuit in which the big other is the effect of, the set of language, if that makes sense. What I find interesting about, if I could add like a little like commentary about this distinction between Schreber and Dora, is that the only way for Lacan's argument to settle the difference between the two is to look at narcissism and its structuration. And what's interesting is that Dora may have these sort of delusional symptoms, but they're sort of like doubtful. But what I find is that they set in when there is a failure of that quadrilateral relationship, which there's only this sort of one-to-one, this imaginary little other that fragmentates in Schreber. And her ego is only, and this is the key term, is mediation. It's only mediated by an alter ego, which is to allow her to understand what is she as a woman. And so that's where Frauke becomes the alter ego, which is a sort of narcissism because she's trying to identify sexually what it means to be a woman and taking on those sort of alienating features that she sees in Frau K. But it's only because what does she want? And this is the distinction between her and Schreber is that her object love is the love of her father, but it's a sort of lack and unknown. So it becomes mediated through Herr K. And so we have these levels of inversion of the message or a mediation that allows her to go into this sort of erotic, Oedipal rivalry. At the same time, it's a rivalry that's aggressive, but at the same time, erotic, which allows the resolve this erotic tension. But at the same time, it's not a success, it's a failure. So this is like the whole point of her Oedipus quadrilateral relations, that she needs Frau K or Herr K to understand what it means to be a woman, insofar as that she may have the ability to attain through this narcissistic investment the love of the father. Which, what does it mean to, for her to be loved by the father, and how does she know that? But only through the mediation between Herr K. And so like once Herr K says that like my wife is nothing to me, that's like, it doesn't necessarily shatter her at first, but then once the quadrilateral aspect of this relationship falls, that's where she kind of starts to have these symptoms. But it's also interesting how they kind of are at bay a bit when Freud enters the picture, because it's like there you're resolving the tension, but with the rise of the transference, it seems like she's trying to invoke this level of quadruplicity in which Freud enters in, right, into his failure, through his countertransference, ruins the entire thing.
Let me ask you this. What do you know how on narcissism, Freud's essay, he describes two types of love, right? Two types of like, I guess he's distinguishing ego libido and object libido.
Yeah.
The ability to make this object choice, but primary narcissism has to do with loving who you believe you were,
right,
was once a part of you, who you'd like to be. And then you have the anaclitic type, which is much more simple. It's like either the person who protects you or the person who feeds you, takes care of you. It's like, don't you think both types of attachment style are almost like condensed in this quadrilateral for?
And this is the main thing, because part of libido, and this is where object relations and other forms of analysis get confused with libido, because they only take attachment, and so they get rid of the sexual part. Is that attachment is only contingent aspect of the libido, in which the more complex it gets in its structuration, it's able to attach and cathex into different objects. But primarily it is sexual because it seeks satisfaction. And so I think the problem with Freud is that he wants to see ultimately that there is a dualism, because we have libido, which seeks its object as this form of satisfaction, and then the ego libido, which is sort of arises from the narcissism but seeks self-preservation. But I think the reconciliation of Lacan is to evoke the mirror stage to show that, well, in the arising of narcissism and this primary narcissism, that there is a lacking, frustrating component, because we have what's at stake with this imaginary mythic moment is that of temporality, and the temporality of the image is so faint that it leads to frustration, because there's a lack of satisfaction in libido, and there couldn't be libido on its own, right? We think of retroactively autoerotic, baby, but we get by structure and contingency the arise of the investment into the bodily image, and through the signifier, or this name of the father, this introduction of the Oedipus complex, it affords us the ability to project out not our body, but our body as object. So the primary narcissism allows for the body to become not an investment of libido, but the body as image or object to become a signifier for object love, in which now we are invested in a world of objects, in which we seek that object as satisfaction. But to make it more Lacanian, it's really for Dora, it's to be able to see like, well, what am I for the other, right? This sense of otherness rather than like, objects.
But I think you mentioned the most important part of the Dora story for this chapter. Why is it in this chapter specifically? Why does he talk about it at that point, and why does he use it to compare it to Schreber? And I think it's because this whole chapter is just about the fact that if the Oedipus complex doesn't happen, if castration doesn't happen, don't have this distance to the little other.
Exactly.
Right? That's when imaginary dissolutions happens, right?
Yeah.
And I think, because I was thinking about why does he mention Dora? And I think it's because in this relationship of four positions, enables this distance in the imaginary relation.
Absolutely. And
then when one part falls out,
yeah,
then a kind of a symptom that's similar to the psychotic appears.
Right, because she's becoming more in proximity to what her desire is, and that's like the father, or what is in question, this object of the father's love. And so not only is it mediated, but there's also this difference in the imaginary sense. There's this difference in distance because of mediation, in this quadrilateral relation that maintains the borderline of aggressiveness and frustration, which is the lack experience in the imaginary of an object, and also the erotic, which is the complete investment of it.
Yeah. But what I was asking myself is, what does love object in this Dora case mean, right? Does it refer to an object of the imaginary, somehow, of the relation that is imaginary? Well, then it would be the father that is the love object, right? But because she, as Lacan says, is in a relation that's motivated by identification and rivalry. I hate this word, man.
Rivalry.
Right? That's the imaginary relationship with her father. Is the love object, in that sense, an object that she has a relationship of the imaginary to? And if that's the case, why does he then say, well, the love object, the true love object, is Frau K? Because she's not in an imaginary relationship with Frau K. Right?
No, so he's, if what he's getting at right here is that Frau K is it's that because she regresses in the sort of narcissistic investment, then Frau K becomes the love object because she's trying to have this sort of libido cathexis into a narcissistic image of herself, but it's not of her, it's how she could relate to whatever Frau K has.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And like to kind of like foreshadow like what we see in seminar 4 of the different types of lack, we have privation, frustration, and castration. And that if there is a lack of an imaginary object, that right there would be so like frustrating. And it's only through the castration, the name of the father, that even if it's lacking, the presence of a signifier to symbolize it allows you to sustain that. So
substitution.
Like the substitution. And so ultimately, like on the imaginary side, it's Frau K, but symbolically it's the love of the father.
Yeah.
But
and that's why the
it's so distant
structure is so painful to her, because in essence it's a Oedipus structure, the threefold thing. So it's like she's asking herself, I'm not quite sure about the female Oedipus conflict, right? But in essence, she's asking, what does my mother have that my father loves? But in that case, it's Frau K that's at that position.
Yeah.
She's asking, what does Frau K have that my father loves?
Exactly.
And she's asking that question through Herr K.
Yes. And
very
Herr K acts like as a medium.
To direct Oedipal relation.
Right. And so this is why it's like we're because I think there's some inquiry with Dora about female homosexuality or lesbian tendencies, but it's not because that's what she feels, but it's that there's something in Frau K Frau K that brings about a narcissistic love in which it's not that she's attracted to a female other as object love, but that this female other represents a love that sustains the mirror stage mythic moment of falling in love with one's body as an object.
Yeah. And she talks about Frau K's body. Like the part about Frau K is so teeny tiny in the Freud study. And also the part about female homosexuality is very small, very short, very brief. But the one part that she says is that she admires the white body of Frau K, right?
Yeah.
But now everything makes sense to me. Like,
yeah. And
K is there to just keep the distance away from the too direct Oedipal relation, which would be an kind of imaginary relation to her father, I guess, if we're talking.
And so what we have,
Lacan
talks about this, I'll just make one more small thing, is this seesaw of desire, as he talks about in Seminar 1 of this, of narcissism, seesawing back and forth between that and its the counterpart of like the symbolic mediation of the love of the father, then, which would, an example would be the father's love, which is the symbolic aspect, and the imaginary aspect of the love and satisfaction is this narcissistic image that she is using Frau K for.
Yeah. I mean, the only part that seems very confusing to me is that, and that might be again a thing where I'm too focused on categories, right? But the distancing aspect is a symbolic one, but in this section about Dora, Freud says Herr K is her alter ego, which would make her ego, just her ego, right? Which would make me think that he's an imaginary figure, right? But I guess the whole relationship of the square is symbolic.
Right. So it is symbolic, and it's not that like, the father himself is imaginary, because she does have interactions with her father. It's the fact that what his desire is distant. And so that's what makes the love symbolic, and why she enters the structuration, because she's unable to know, and he's not as interactive with her, that she uses Herr K as a sort of messenger, while having this imaginary identification with Frau K.
Yeah. And the phrase that Herr K uses makes him unfit, I guess, for this mediating role, because she needs him to desire Frau K.
Yeah.
Because that's what she is, that's what her question is all about. What's the desirable thing about Frau K? Right? But that makes so much sense, because he also mentions her aphonia, right? Her impossibility to speak, which is related to her coughing, right? And I love that Freud analyzes it and says, well, behind the coughing, it starts with a tingle in the neck. So behind that is a fantasy of her father getting oral sex from Frau K. And she's putting herself into the position of Frau K in that scenario.
Right.
Yeah, but how does this all relate to Schreber is the question.
Well, because Schreber doesn't have a quadrilateral relation, or even a tripartite that's symbolically structured. Everything to him is sort of distant and faint, with cryptic voices, imaginary little men that sustain his ego, which in the previous chapter, like Lacan says in using the optical, or not the optical schema, the schema L, that the difference between the psychotic and the neurotic is that there's always this mediating structure between little other and big other, and that, of course, the ego is an alienation, so the ego is an other, and then the admittance of the symbolic, or the name of the father, allows for the other to become symbolic big other. And that for Schreber, he's completely identified with this imaginary ego, because that's all he has to sustain him. So I mean, in its structure, it fragments, because it has no signifier to sustain the temporality. It's
I mean, it has no signifier to maintain the distance
and the distance, yeah.
to the little others, right? And that's
Yeah.
why the little others are constantly like merge with his body, right? I mean, the little men, they are little others kind of, and they are merging with his body, right? Entering his body.
Yeah.
And also the other relations with other little others, he can't sustain, also because he doesn't have the signifier, or he didn't go through the Oedipus complex, in the sense that his little others are souls, they are dead. So they're not really sustained, or they dissolve in the unity of God, as you said, Nick. Or the other possible little others are not real, right? They're just the fleeting men. And even he himself, as a little other, is dead, right?
Yeah.
So he can't even sustain an imaginary relationship because he doesn't have that distance of the signifier.
Yep.
And that's I guess why the world is ending, and why he has to have a continuously ambiguous relationship with God to make it impossible that God merges with him. Because if he merges with him, then the world will vanish, right?
Yeah.
And I love Schreber's narcissism is so huge. Like he says that he's just so attractive, right? He's just too attractive for everyone. That's why everyone is merging with him. And what I also love is that the word he uses, why is he so attractive to nerves, right? To the nerves that are the souls. He's so attractive to the nerves because he's so nervous, because nervous illness, right?
Yeah.
And his nervousness is so huge that he's so attractive to all these other souls. But I mean, the question I have is, the word ambiguous in this chapter appears so many times. There's first the ambiguous relationship to Herr K, which the moment that it is not ambiguous anymore destroys the whole situation, right? Destroys the whole square. Then there's the ambiguous relationship of the stickleback. I was imagining it as a bird the whole time. Like my whole image is destroyed, that it's a little fish. But he has an imaginary...
I Googled the stickleback, and I was kind of disappointed of like
tiny fish.
Yeah, how small the fishes are. But apparently they're carnivores. They eat little fishes, or like little sea.
They eat even smaller fishes. Oh my God.
Yeah.
They eat little fish men.
Yeah.
The stickleback has an ambiguous relationship when it's this decoy that appears at the borderline, right? And then the third ambiguous thing is the word luder and the relationship to God. So I was thinking, okay, you have the imaginary, which is just aggression or eroticism. And then you have the ambiguous element. Does he want to say that ambiguous elements are the kind of elements that are the symbolic which create the distance? Or am I over-interpreting?
That's actually a creative way to think about it, because I never paid attention to the ambiguous part. But I would say that, if there is this like sort of distance via the signifier, the name of the Father, and we should think of like this the signifier and the name of the Father as consubstantial. That's how Lorenzo Chiesa tells us, like in the subjectivity of otherness, which I think is really perfect, because it clarifies not only what the name of the Father is, but how it's a coexisting function with the signifier. And that for at least for Dora, it has to remain ambiguous, because she wants to know what is the love of her Father. Everything about her desire for to be desirable for her Father and to know what it means to be desirable is very much ambiguous. This quadruplicity for a hysteric, or a hysteric's desire, is to always remain ambiguous and to keep the desire sustained, because once it is in close proximity, it dismantles everything. The hysteric, like the obsessional erotic, sabotages stuff, but she needs to sustain confusion, and she needs to sustain ambiguity, because that's what evokes the desire for her. Whereas like for the obsession, it's mastery and the fear of life. Yeah.
If you think about Herr K, though, what's really interesting, ambiguous, I don't know about the second part of the word, but like the first part, ambi, I mean, it's like both sides, right? And it's like if you think about schema L and the imaginary wall of language and the two poles that you have there, who allows Dora to remain in this ambiguous relationship but Herr K initially? Because it's like those are the two sides of ambiguity, is like her father and Herr K, and then Herr K, I think as you put it, Max, is like the vehicle for this object choice, which is the love that she has for her father, but also the rivalrous identification with him. But once Herr K states outright that his wife means nothing to him, it cuts right through the ambiguity. It's completely unambiguous, so it ruins the quadrilateral there.
Yeah.
But I mean, one really has to ignore the real story of Dora, for this whole interpretation, because it's completely, I feel like it doesn't fit what Lacan is saying to the real story, because why this sentence is so dramatic for her in the actual case study from Freud is that Herr K was approaching like one of his servants, right? And was trying to seduce her and said the same thing. You know, my wife means nothing to me.
Yeah.
And then he had sexual relations with this woman. And then he basically just threw her away, like totally ignored her afterwards. And why the sentence is so devastating to Dora is that she was hoping he would really marry her and would really love her. But when she hears the sentence, she's like, oh, you're just interested in sex, right? Like with this servant. But I mean, maybe that's not so important, right? I mean, Lacan just takes it and changes it how he wants it and then uses it for something else, right? Yeah. So I mean, we kind of see that the psychotic doesn't have this this square relationship, and that means it doesn't have the distance of the signifier.
Yeah.
Then in the third part, Lacan kind of mentions all these effects that has for Schreber, right? Which is one of the effects is that all the things that we said, that he completely melts into the little others, but he has to maintain that ambiguous relationship with God. And I thought like, okay, it's ambiguous, just like the relationship that Dora has to Herr K. And through that ambiguous relationship, she holds up this square. And I was thinking, okay, so I mean, Freud also says like delusion is not the sickness, it's the solution, right? For the problem.
Yeah.
So I was thinking,
because it's like a
creating that
structuring.
delusion of an ambiguous relationship to sustain the existence of the world for him.
Right.
Keep off imaginary dissolution, right?
Right, because I mean, if you think about again, that essay had referenced a couple of times, neurosis and psychosis and the loss of reality. It's like reality, is lost for both the psychotic and the neurotic. But for the neurotic, repression and substitution become that piece that kind of again, our earlier conversation before we recorded, we were talking about metaphor metonymy. Well, I think the signifier has a sort of metonymic function to encompass a totality for a world of libido investment for the neurotic. And it happens in this, whether it's an obsessional that has a sort of triangulation love with a rivalrous imaginary or symbolic male that threatens to castrate them, and this woman that has the sort of good thing, the agama in them, or a quadruplicity of a hysteric, that this metonymic function creates their world, versus a world that is lost by a psychotic. The only way they could sort of structure it are through these temporal imaginary moments that are delusional. But that delusion, even how fragmented it is the way that it keeps this reality from being lost.
Well, what about this dimension of the signifier that I guess Max was talking about, which like allows one to be sustained in a state of ambiguity without it being maddening, right? Like in the
Yeah.
sense that the signifier comes along and in it is condensed both like the seesaw of desire between eros and aggressivity in a way that we're able to maintain this balance, but like wretch
Mm-hmm.
for Schreber, it's all laid bare,
Yeah.
right? The fact that
Yeah.
you have complete ambiguity and crypticness of this utterance, which is semi-sexual, semi-aggressive. It's all concentrated in this word, right? So it's like
Yeah.
he's not able to avail himself of the
Right.
signifier which comes from without.
Right.
Does that make sense? Kind of like there
And that's
isn't
why it's castrating,
be
right? That's
of
why
a
it's
hair.
feminizing. Schreber is the
Right.
original sissification.
Yeah. The original sissification. Yeah.
No, I wanted to say, like, okay, it is. I'm not sure about what I'm saying. I just noticed that ambiguity is like a thing that's continuous in this chapter. And I mean, what you said makes sense because this word luder, it's extremely ambiguous. It has both the things of the imaginary dialectic in it without deciding for one side, right? Without being absorbed or destroying the other.
Right.
And that this is the symbolic would be proven by the fact that this word luder is also the thing that is feminizing him.
Yeah.
Because feminization means castration, and castration means that the signifier enters him, right?
Right. Right.
I'm also thinking of how like we're talking about metonymy earlier, and I'm really looking forward to reading that chapter because it's like with metonymy, it's like, okay, with this substitution, another signifier does the work of the signifier, which always fails to represent the subject
Right.
ultimately. But that's not possible for Schreber
Yeah.
in the sense that, like for him signifiers are working overtime. So instead of like the kind of duality of the signifier which the neurotic relies on, where it's kind of like, okay, well, tell me something else, explain this further by means of another signifier, and so on and so on. But that's not maddening in the way that just one word that is supercharged with meaning is. Remember, Schreber divides language into two categories in that sense. So
Right.
instead of fire itself having these two sides to it, it's like, no, language is, it's either super meaningful or completely empty. There's no in between.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
I guess I would say, because you mentioned metonymy and metaphor, that I think it's pretty clear. I don't know what to make of it, but I just think the association is obvious, that the mechanical repetition of phrases that he hears, which is not the echt, that's a metonymic thing, right? It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And the things that are echt, they are pretty much metaphor. It's like luder, right? I mean, I'm not sure. He can't have metaphor.
No, you can't have metaphor or metonymy, really. But
see, because if it's mechanical, it's literally like devoid of any sense, any meaning. And then the fundamental language isn't metaphorical because
that's right.
to get to the other side of it.
Yeah.
Right. He just accepts it. The certainty is that it's for him.
Yeah.
He's confused he's not bothered by his confusion in a sense.
Yeah, because he's ultimately identified with this world, or like even its decay, and it's for him, and God is for him, this mission that he's on. And that's why, there is no other symbolically, because that part, the signifier that allows for that to be possible is foreclosed. And so we have a world that's full of meaning, but it's only temporally imaginary through these delusions. When he's not having them, there's really no signification at all well, there's
I
no
mean, for him,
signification
it's full of
entirely,
meaning.
but
For
like,
us, not.
you
Right?
know,
For us,
these neologisms only arise momentarily, and they have no relation to other neologisms.
yeah.
Only in the set delusion.
Right, they're always interrupted too.
Yeah.
And it's like that's what I said. It's like these neologisms, they only point to themselves.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So the extent to which you're able to conceptualize a signified, it's already contained in the effect of the signifier.
There's no
It
difference.
doesn't on other signifier.
And it's not referential. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
Like
and that's the thing that he said in the beginning, right? That it's a linguistic phenomenon that happens in psychosis, which does not happen for Dora. And the two linguistic phenomena, I guess it's neologism. And on the other hand, it's the interruption of the sentences that they don't finish.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Because and that's where we get like the whole thing of like, I mean, logical time, but like the time of the sentence and how there's this sort of anticipation within a sentence and how it completes and it retroactively comes back to the subject of the statement to account for itself. That's the whole thing that makes language so important in analysis, and even for you know, the analyzan is that aspect of being able to account for oneself in this. It goes
the quilting point.
Yeah, and it goes back to it goes back on that. It goes back to our example with, you know, with Leon Brenner about like, you know, look out for your teammate. You know, when he says it little by little, it's like there's a pressurized time of anticipation to be able to, you know, quilt it and account for like the subject of the statement and the subject of enunciation, maybe. But I know, like, as for like what I'm trying to say is at least on the subject of the statement and what the statement is precluding to.
I mean, the relationship of time would be so interesting to investigate in psychosis, right? Because when I read his memoir, it felt like huge chunks of time for him were missing when he was like in a delusion. Like right. One delusion was great where he went to a faraway castle and he had to build a wall to defend God against a yellow ocean, which stands for syphilis, right? A syphilitic ocean endangering God, right? But that it seemed like he was like in this delusion in a different place, in a completely different place, and he lost sense of time, right? So I guess that would be related to the absence of a quilting point, this kind of loss of time. And I want to recommend a movie, okay? I watched in the cinema recently, which relates to this. I think the English title is Repulsion, from, what's his name? The guy who made Rosemary's Baby.
Polanski.
Yeah.
It's with Catherine Deneuve, and it's about a woman who literally has a psychotic breakdown. And I watched it and I was like, oh my God, you can perfectly use this analysis that Lacan gives us to look at this movie.
Oh, yeah.
But on a different note, like for me, what's difficult is what to make of these words or these phrases that come to him that are echt. Because, so the way I understand it is, he doesn't have the symbolic order as a symbolic big other. He doesn't have it as a he. He only has it as a you. And he has to do so much work in his delusion. He has to invent so much stuff to just keep the world from vanishing in imaginary dissolution. And he does that by sustaining the existence of language, but in a relationship to language as a little other, which would be God, right? Mm-hmm. And he sustains the world by keeping God away from him and at the same time still attracting him through his extreme nervousness. And in other ways, he also tries to sustain little others when he says like, some little men or some souls are connected to celestial bodies, right? Mm-hmm. Which Lacan says is a kind of pre-modern symbolic operation, like of the episteme. And it's like an indirect reference to Poiret in that, because Poiret says in the episteme, in the ancient science, it's all about the reference to the celestial bodies, right? And yeah, he talks about the brothers of Cassiopeia, and these little souls, they sustain themselves by being connected to celestial bodies. So that's also a way how he tries to sustain the existence of a little other and keep it a little bit away from him, right? But what is mysterious to me is, what is the role of these enigmatic signifiers? Or, I mean, it's not a signifier, maybe it's a signifier that he gets from the big other as a little other, that is God.
Well, isn't it interesting, though, if you think about schema L, how we have the imaginary wall of language is how it's referred to.
Exactly.
It's the imaginary dimension. This is what I'm trying to get my head wrapped around, how the symbolic is hooked onto the imaginary. I think schema L kind of
same.
It's the imaginary wall of language, which in a sense acts as a barrier between the subject and the big other. For the neurotic, the big other would be God.
Right.
It's also where language emanates from, but it's a backdrop to language, and it's language itself that in some sense protects the subject from their unconscious. Whereas for Schreber, God is language. There is no big other. Right. There is no language doesn't have a protective function.
Yeah. It's a cryptic voice. It's a cryptic voice that's like just faint. And you know, this relation of, and you mentioned the hooking of the symbolic with the imaginary, because it's like, what's the difference between an imaginarized sign, right, or symbol, and a sort of symbolized image, if that makes sense? I know, like, is it in 49 now what they do, like Zizek breaks this down, but it's like there's a difference between saying like the sign of the cross and having a painting of, you know, Jesus, you know, on the crucifix, you know, or like let's say we have the signifier beautiful, and that's just a signifier. Well, what does that entail? And then you have the image of Mona Lisa, and then, you know, you have that as a sort of encapsulation of how beauty can be imaginarized, right? And this is how it happens in analysis, where you have certain signifiers that you wouldn't even think are possible, like, or relevant in the free association, but yet they're pointing out, like, what does the signifier mean, right? And like, you can't account for that. And so through the moment of understanding, you're able to come to a sort of image to think of that. Even if it's failed or not, it'll probably be, you know, an error. But the fact that the imaginary tries to account in a misrecognized form this image, and yet at the same time, the imaginary wall of language affords us to be protected by the invasion of signifiers that rupture the continuity of the hooking. I don't know if that makes any sense. Right. I just put that on the spot.
The symbolic on its own is nothing. I think that's what we're going to get with the quilt point. And this is what I think often goes misrecognized about the relationship between the imaginary and the symbolic, especially as Chiesa was saying in our recent interview, the fact that it's often thought of as the shit register, the imaginary, does a disservice to the entire Baromean, not in the sense that, like, the symbolic is not where the content is either. Right. The whole point of the quilting point is that and the best example, we use it all the time though, is the one for they know not what they do, about the sum of all fears being the fear of God, which in a sense is contentless, right? What God could do to you, he could do all of all the individual fears that you have of famine, bad weather, enemies, you know, your fellow man. He can do all that and so much more, and things that you can't imagine.
Right.
But it's
surplus, you know,
like this surplus, this empty category, which comes to like be overarching for all of the subspecies of it, that we get the symbolic proper, but it's ultimately without content. That's not to say the imaginary is where the content is either, but we are able to, like you said, like, you know, create an image of the signifiers that emerge, which have a kind of symbolic efficacy to them.
And this made me realize
they don't really mean anything
And
on
this
their
made
own.
me realize, going back to that specific example of quilting point and the sum of all fears in Zizek, because it didn't make sense to me why he placed the ego ideal as the focal point of quilting point. But now it makes sense, because if we're talking about how we're able to represent the universal, which at first is empty, like God as to be feared, but then once it starts to be able to take an imaginarized relation of the sign in the moment of the ego ideal, well, we have the point at which we're able to identify with it, but it's always already a misrecognition, right? And that's how misrecognition of the sign takes place. But my main point is that, well, what Lacan has been stating in the early seminar of Seminar 1, that, well, what the ego does with the signifiers, it tries to synthesize this antagonism of different signs, but it's already a failure because you can never get a full signified. That the signified is this process of synthesis on the level of the ego. But because we have this antagonism of negation and affirmation, Verneinung, we get this impossibility of that. I don't know if that is helpful, but it just made me think that in that example that Zizek gives of quilting point, the different particular fears and the sum of all fears being quilted into the fear of God, that he then talks about how we see how the signifiers quilt into the master signifier, which gets sort of inverted and filtered through the ego ideal.
But I mean, to go back to the beginning of this whole question, like, how does the imaginary get hooked on the symbolic? I guess it's through metaphor, because the symbolic gets created through metaphor, through the paternal metaphor, right?
Well, yes, it's hooked in there, and then that real hooking becomes virtual. And so when we have the mirror stage and the optical schema, we see how this narcissism becomes not just a real image, like when he talks about the inverted bouquet, but then an image that could be not just real, which the real is already an inversion, but and I mean like the real image, not the real register, but then the way that it can function virtually. And that's what ego ideal is. And that's the way in which the virtuality of signifiers get synthesized in the process of the hooking.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, like, so imaginary, I guess imaginary, it relates to the signified, and signified its meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and so I mean, the beginning of the symbolic order, it's like, what was it again? It's like the father, the phallos means desire of the mother, right? Is it that, right?
No. So you have symbolic phallus, which is the name, is part of the name of the father, the consubstantial aspect. The maternal phallus is the imaginarized form of the mother's desire, but what the maternal phallus is the image of the baby that is implanted by the mother that substitutes her desire for the father.
Right. So it works ways, but I mean, I guess in simple terms, it's kind of like once the name of the father comes along, it names the desire of the mother and tells the child, this is what you wanted all along.
Right.
And and you can't have it.
Right.
Because hence it would mean the dissolution of your being, of your sense of subjectivity, to succumb to like your incestuous desire. So that's why you're a priori guilty in a sense.
I mean, I was talking about this formula, from Lacan. It's a name of the father, and then it's like the bar, right? And then it's father's desire.
And so like even with the child and the mother, it's not a dual or two-body relation. It is a sort of imaginarized triangle, which is the baby, the mother, and the imaginary phallus. And that imaginary phallus is the sort of hooking image that allows for the mirror stage or the narcissism to develop for the baby.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking of so I watched Becker's video on this lecture, and he talks about, the famous Shakespeare line, Juliet is the sun, right? It's like, that's the metaphor par excellence in English literature. And it's like, okay, so the effect of that is ultimately imaginary, and it's built on repression. It could mean many things to many people, right? There's not one univocal definition of what that means, but somehow it works, right? It's like we take these two signifying networks, which in everyday speech do not belong to one another, with one another, make them overlap at a certain, point of tension, and it creates a sort of effect. I mean, this is literary metaphor, of course, the metaphor for metaphor in a sense, but it's
Yeah,
as if
sure.
the enjoyment we get from it has to do with the signified could be many things, but it's only because most of us neurotic that we aren't, vexed by the metaphor he presents, right? Because it's built on repression. A whole series of substitutions has to take place to connect these two signifying networks in a way that suddenly makes sense. It does have a kind of instantaneousness to it, but at the same time, someone else might be like, yo, that's a shit metaphor. That doesn't work.
It's a bit
not a good
shitty. I
metaphor.
mean, the play is overrated, most overrated
Yeah.
Shakespeare play. But
That's the interesting thing, though, about
yeah,
like you could take it to a Kantian level of like the aesthetic, right? It's
Right.
like taste.
Yeah,
yeah,
You can't,
totally.
absolutely.
but then again, there are certain laws of taste, right? Like
Right.
Shakespeare is better than Christopher Marlowe. Like
Right,
you can't
or
argue
because
against that.
then there would be like those artists would be like, well, like, I want to just like, those like college artists that'd be like, I just want to take a video of like me, like, I don't know, beating off or like taking a shit on the side of, and like, that's art. Like I'm being rebellious. And I actually went to like some sort of art expo, at when I was young at was it Cal Poly Pomona, and there was in the art exhibit somebody literally filming themselves beating off, and it was the most disgusting thing ever. Like, but like that just shows it's like that's not art. There is a sort of faculty of valuation of taste, morality, or whatever,
Yeah, but I also think, like, to go back to that metaphor of the sun, right? It's totally, in that metaphor, you can totally see the imaginary as a semblance of totality, right? It's like, wow, Juliet is the sun. That means everything, kind of. But at the same time, it leaves like a huge space open for metonymy, I guess, to go on to, well, what does that mean that she means the sun, and so on and so on.
Right.
That's what Zizek always says, and so on, because he's the truth of metonymy.
Yep.
But I wanted to say,
yeah, because what is that excess but an indivisible remainder?
Yes,
that indivisible remainder, that small thing substitutes for the totality, that rejected little piece. That's where I think we're elaborating right here on like trying to understand what this is, but we got to think, what is the signifier that Lacan comes up with, which is his sort of ontology, which is like of the real, which is the objet a, and that is a rejected piece of the signifier, that excremental excess that sort of becomes metonymic for the subject's desire.
Yeah, totally. But I am still wondering what the Luder is all about and why it is echt. So I guess he doesn't feel that kind of lack, right? In that lack of meaning, right? In that sense that this is totally enough for him to hear Luder. But I'm still wondering what to make of it, because as we established, it's not that the psychotic doesn't have symbolic at all, or that he doesn't have the signifier at all. It's just that it appears in the place where it was repressed, right? It just comes from the outside, right? As an imaginary other.
Yeah.
This imaginary other, which is the symbolic, says Luder to him, and it means everything to him. And I don't quite understand why.
Well, my thing is like, well, if that feminizes him, it's also sort of a weird, to use the term that you pointed out, ambiguity, because his whole life is like he couldn't live up to the expectations of his father. He couldn't give if I'm not mistaken, his wife kids, right? So he's like living this life as a failure. And then it's only until he is appointed the title as president, as a judge, that's when everything crumbles down. Like he's identifying with the law, and that crumbles him down. And like, well, if he isn't living up to be a man, then what is he other than, feminine? But he gets solace, or at least he has some type of like comfortability being feminized in the psychotic's position. But at the same time, if he encounters the threat of castration, it's a threat because it ends his whole world. And what is it to be castrated but to be man? But if he has to be a man, he has to that he is not a man because he has trouble living up with the name of the Father.
I like that. Because the thing is, like, the whole story has a good end, right? I mean, in the beginning, he's like, what would it be like to enjoy as a woman? And then he's confronted with this extremely horrible fantasy of being a woman and being raped, right? Mm-hmm. And this just makes him so afraid, and he doesn't like it. I mean, that's the threat of castration that comes to him, and he tries to fight it. But then his extreme megalomania kicks in, right? And he's like trying to make this castration into something positive by saying, well, I am the wife of God, which is like the highest level of possibly being feminized. I'm being feminized as the wife of God. I'm being sissified as the sissy of God, right? And so that kind of solved the problem for him, that he can accept that. And so that's when his psychotic break ends. He accepts castration, but only in the sense that he is feminized for God.
Yeah.
You know what came to mind for me here, and maybe this is no pun intended, far-fetched, but Fort Da here, if you think about Da being like the birth of the symbol, we have Fort Da is like a encapsulation of an imaginary dialectic, right? It's like it's aggressive, but it's also erotic, and that like you're drawing forward. Like the mother's also here, right? Yeah. Being drawn forward, and cast out. Like, I hate you, I reject you, I bring you back in, Fort Da. And like the way the child enjoys this game, it becomes sort of the foundation of language. Wretch has almost like a similar function here, right?
Wretch except once, and what makes Da a more sexualized thing and sort of enjoyable thing is the repetition of it and the way that it repeats in different forms. There's none of that in Wretch. We only at least get that once. So we have no ability.
We get that once from God saying it to him.
God.
But also the little men sometimes say it to him. When the little men, you know what they do? They want to close his eyes because they walk around on his face.
Right. But with God, though, it
pushes them away, and then they say to him.
But isn't it interesting with God, though? It's that he has this sort of reaction that resembles the stickleback. And so I think that's the difference, because if we said that God for him represents this sort of unity of those little men in an imaginarized form, but it's like, it's not a signifier. But when God, who's supposed to be his lover, says that, that's where he enters this weird position of ambiguity that's to the stickleback. And I think that's the difference. But with the Fort Da, it's like the death drive component of this is this repetition compulsion to be able to encounter the object and also reject it as well.
No, that
refine really it. Interesting. And because part of narcissism and in the sexual theory of Freud is that an object is always a refining of an object. So the object casted out is always refounded in a different form. And so this is where the first sexual object is the narcissism one. And then it evolves over time.
But I think what Nick was saying was great, like, because that linked imaginary to symbolic somehow. How do we get from that? Yeah.
Right.
What's fascinating, though, is that like you get the impression that for Schreber, nothing's a repetition. Everything is new every time. It feels like,
except the repeated phrases that are like mechanically repeating, that are not echt.
Because when we think about Fort Da, though, it's that like it doesn't happen traumatically for the baby, but it then like it's repeated through the games. And so I think that's where the signifier takes its place, is when it's repeated through different scenarios.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's like no repetition for Schreber, but it's almost like you get the impression reading his memoirs that like the slate is constantly being wiped clean.
Yeah.
That's true.
And it's like every experience is novel. I mean, that's what the sort of poetic effect it has, even though he's not a
Right.
poet.
No, he's not a
It's like
poet now.
not
And
a
often
poet,
he
but
says, and that's just like when, and then he talks about something that's completely different, like something completely different, and you're completely thrown off. But I really liked what you were saying, Nick, that, okay, if we say somehow castration or the symbolic comes to him, and we said, so, okay, imaginary relationship, it's just kill or fuck, right? It's just the
Yeah.
two options.
Right.
Whereas maybe we could say, I don't know, we were talking about it like this, the ambiguous thing that's neither the one nor the other is the symbolic somehow. And you were saying, well, this kind of ambiguity also appears in the fourth Da thing, because I don't want to go too far off, but maybe. And in that sense, the symbolic comes to him as an ambiguous thing, which is the word luder. And that's why Lacan brought the ambiguity up with the Stickleback, where he said, if there's an ambiguous element, you default to eroticism. And in the same sense, Schreber defaults to eroticism when he's confronted with the ambiguous thing.
well, what is Lacan say? He says that this word luder, it's like the kind of word you might say if you're trying to resist someone's advances. Also,
Yeah.
there's an but I thought of like a coy kind of resistance, like oh no, don't, which reminds me of Dora.
Hey,
Then
Nick,
because,
no
like,
means
Dora
no, okay? You're treading into dangerous water. But I wanted to say that what he says about the word luder, right? He says, insults are very frequent in the divine partner's relationship with Schreber. As in the erotic relationship that one initially, yeah, that's why he was saying that, initially refuses to take part in and resists. And then he says, so these insults, this is the other face, the counterpart of the imaginary world. The annihilating insult is the culminating point. It is one of the peaks of the speech act. So I guess he's saying it's the imaginary. And peaks of the speech act, I'm unsure, maybe it's a little bit in the direction of quilting point, but I think he definitely says that it's a symbolic element invading his world as spoken.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, though, I feel like when people are some people talking about like transitioning from the imaginary to the symbolic, it's like once you get to the heart of the symbolic, I feel like you're thrust right back into this imaginary dialectic, which is symbolized for you in the same way that the signifier is imaginarized for you in a way. So that's the whole point of the retroactivity of Lacan's account of, the mirror stage that like always has to be kept in mind. It's not the mirror stage. It's not a stage until we get to the symbolic.
No.
I don't know if that's relevant to what you're talking about right now, but that's just what came to mind.
I think that's so interesting, like that so often, as you guys said, as Lorenzo Chiesa said, that the imaginary is like the shitty register, right? No one wants to talk about it. But I think maybe in this chapter and in everything that you said, Nick, also in relation to the fourth Da game, it's clear that they are so closely linked, imaginary and symbolic.
Right. Well, so and when we talk about the mirror stage as this mythic moment retroactively, we also have to talk about this term, the imprinting of the subject, but it gets pretty much repressed. So we have the imaginarized identification form of misrecognition. This traumatic imprinting, the German term is Prägung or Prägung.
Yeah.
And like, the striking of a coin, the image of a coin. And so right there marks the time of the subject. And so that is put on the level of the unconscious. And yet the stuff that isn't repressed has a sort of affective dimension to bring about the mirror stage. And that right there is where we get in this moment of the marking of the subject, the mother leaving the baby for the Fort Da situation. It doesn't seem to have any repetition effect until we see it played out in the games of the tossing of toys and bringing them back in, or as he says, it's like these linguistic phenomenon of certain noises of ooh and ah, and then how that translates into these games of throwing toys, bringing it back in, and then the silk reel of tossing it and bringing it, like that is the way in which then this moment where everything comes in then gets rejected because of the formation of repression, and then we have a sort of filtering in of certain things, and that excremental remainder is the real that comes back because of repression. But it's always like in the sort of inverted form because of what the imaginary does. And so what allows the imaginary and the symbolic to be in a dynamic with each other is this point of hooking. And I think the point of hooking is always that ego ideal aspect for the neurotic, and that's where they're able to bring everything in. And even the quilting point, because the letter becoming the signifier. A letter isn't anything until it becomes the position of the signifier. Did he leave the chat?
I don't know. He said he wants to go early, but he left a little bit unceremoniously, right?
Oh, okay.
I don't know. But can you say again what?
I'm the host now. Yeah, I'm recording.
You're the boss now, exactly.
Yeah.
So where does Prägung appear in Freud?
I think he talks about it in The Wolfman, and I know that Lacan brings this up in the Nucleus of Repression seminar, which is in Seminar 1, where he talks about, we could think of repression as forgetfulness. So now he relates it to Heidegger, how there's a forgetting of Dasein, and it's not just that you forget about being, but you even forget about the forgetting. You know, this is like double negation. And so this printing for him is where trauma is reconstructed retroactively. And this is what's key, I think, about the difference between the neurotic versus the psychotic when it comes to time, because you have to think about time in the term of Neutralikeit, this retroactive time, which is also temporal. And that in this temporal moment, and it also comes back to how signifiers represent also screen memory, you know, art memory that's not of like actual event, but it's artificially. That memory isn't something that emerges, but memory is something that is formed in that temporal moment, that we have a formation and a reconstruction of the subject's time, the subject's history, and how it acts in time. So it's like he calls it, an Adrian Johnson kind of doubles down on this dialectization of past and present.
But what's being imprinted where?
It's the subject of the unconscious that is being imprinted in this mythic scene. And I think it's the primal scene. It's the primal scene.
I see.
Yeah.
It's very fitting that it's in the Wolfman case, because I think most people, if they hear imprinting, they immediately think of this very embarrassing part of Twilight, you know, where the Wolfman, who's fully adult, gets to know the baby.
Yeah.
Right? Because the baby's imprinted or something, and that means that they will be in a relationship later on.
Right.
No, but I mean, we kind of touched on everything, right?
Yeah. I think we could quilt it right there.
Yeah. Do we want to make a final statement?
Yeah. Well, I think to sum everything up is that we see the distinction between, for Lacan in the seminar, at this point, psychosis and neurosis on the level of narcissism, and how libido structure and the distinction of eroticism and aggressivity play out. But that in primary narcissism, it's not just this relation to one's body, but then how it sort of creates itself as an object and then sublimates itself into these relations. And for Dora as a hysteric, it's this quadrilateral relation that means everything, but also is at the same time ambiguous. Whereas we touch down, for many times, we're just seeing it in a different manner. Psychosis is always this imaginary fragmenting that is momentary, and has no relation to really much any other delusion. And I think that is the key to understanding the complexity of psychosis, but also how even if someone like Dora has a delusion, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a diagnosis of psychosis, because he even says that he's hesitant to use this term whenever he hears delusions, that delusions are something specific. They're a substitute to structure temporarily this longevity of a reality for a psychotic, but for the psychotic, a reality is already lost. It's dead. It's been dead. Schreber's been dead. Flessing has been dead, right? And so I think that is my attempt to summarize this.
And that's a big difference with psychoanalysis to psychology, right? That it's not about the symptoms. It's about what's the reason for the symptoms, what's the structure.
The structure, yeah.
You can't just say, oh, someone has delusions, they are psychotic. Oh, they want to eat fresh brains, they are psychotic.
Yeah.
No. Okay, I'm just gonna also just add a little thing to it, which is, for me, this chapter, it's titled Imaginary Dissolution, because it's about what happens if you don't have castration, aka the name of the father, right, the Oedipus complex, the signifier. Because if you don't have it, your narcissistic relationship to a little other cannot be sustained, because you immediately absorb this little other or are absorbed. And yeah, in Dora, we can see that she can sustain this relationship only through an ambiguous element in a square structure.
Mm-hmm.
And Schreber doesn't have a square structure, so he has to work out multiple kinds of delusions to sustain the existence of himself and the world through an ambiguous relationship to the symbolic order, which appears to him in the form of a little other.
Right. Perfect.
That was it. Yeah. Now you have to stop the recording and hopefully don't lose it again.
Yes.
So you have to be careful, please.
Yeah. And that is the quilting point. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.